games themselves teach us how to play them, but not how to read them. And what I'm saying is, this is a call to action to players to choose based on what you think you're going to get out of something.
I'm going to start the AA model of game club, where I stand up and say, "Hi everyone, I'm Jeremy, and I had an authentic experience in games that helped me grow." Hi, Jeremy. Tracy Fullerton is head of the renowned Games Lab at the University of Southern California and is on the board of directors for Square Enix and Games for Change. Her book, Game Design Workshop, for years has taught pixel pushers that finding the fun is about process, not vision, and her students include the makers of Threes, Journey, The Outer Wilds, and more. Her new book is called The Well-Read Game, and Tracy joins us on grokludo to talk about a deeper way of playing games, building on reader response theory, and arguing that not only can it be adapted to games, but in some ways games are more of a fertile ground for a reading than a book. Your book is The Well-Read Game. Hey, there you go. I have a Kindle version. It's not as fun to look at. It's why the well-read game and not the well-played game or the well-studied game?
So it is the title, The Well-Read Game, is a play on Bernie DeKoven's book, and that is The Well-Played Game. His philosophy of play is something that inspired me, throughout my career. This, his idea, is that to be well played, a game is not, it doesn't mean to be an expert at the play, and it doesn't mean to achieve. It means to play a game in a way that makes us well, that is holistically an experience that is positive for us, that in whatever way it needs to be, whether that means that we are kind with ourselves in regards to how we interpret the rules, or whether it means that we are harder on ourselves because we're a better player than our friends, so we have a better, tighter match, right? But this book is not necessarily, it's not the same. It is a book about reading games as personal aesthetic experiences, interpreting them, and valuing that personal reading in the same way that we value talking about our experiences watching films and listening to music and maybe reading a poem. The whole point of those art forms is to provoke personal responses and talk about them together. And that is, for me, the jewel that we bring back at the end of playing a game, right? It's not how many points I had. It's not where I sat on the leaderboard. So that's why it's the well-read game, because I think that reading is something we associate with interpretation.
And it's also sort of building on work from, I guess, going all the way back to like the 1930s, right? Like there was Louise Rosenblatt.
John Dewey. Yeah.
And John Dewey. They were talking about literature and how there's a reading. And so you're kind of building on those ideas. And, another sort of author that you mention a lot in the well-read game is James Paul G. Both Rosenblatt and G seem to talk about this third thing between the player and the game, which I guess it's been called like an evocation or a reading or like some kind of event that happens between a person and the game, which is like an experience at a moment in time.
Yeah, because we're different every time we play, or every time we read a book, every time we play a game, we bring to it a different person. That's coming from a reader response theory, and Louise Rosenblatt's theories. And she talks about the event of a reader coming together with a text, and that reader is in a certain state in their life and has bringing all these life experiences and where they sit in a culture, and they're bringing it to that text, right? And they're bringing that text alive. They're literally living an event that is the reading of that text. And I think that it's even more apt to say that of a video game, to be honest, because when we come to a video game, of course it's an event when we play it, right? I mean, you might say, "Oh, it's not really an event when you read a book," and I'm like, "Well, it actually is an event when you play a game. In fact, it's so much an event that the game doesn't, in many ways, truly exist until you play it. It's just an inert set of code, right? It's an inert set of bits, right? And until you come and play it, it it doesn't actually have any form. And when I play it, I not only cause the software to run, but it also cause my mind and my imagination to evoke a series of responses that I think are the game itself, right? Because the game will be evoked differently by every single player.
You ask people in the book to provide their what you called aesthetic readings of games, which is sort of, I guess, in the terminology used in the book, these are people who have deliberately taken an aesthetic stance while reading a game and sort of inwardly looking and reflecting on what they were feeling and noticing happening inside themselves. And importantly, they were journaling it right afterwards. And you kind of, when you ask people to do this, you ask them to sort of describe what was happening as if you were describing a dream to a friend. And I felt like that was apt because dreams, like, you kind of have to have a journal right next to your bed if you want to like capture it. Otherwise, it's like, 5 minutes later and you've forgotten it. And it's a little bit similar with these kinds of readings, right? Because it's like you think that you'll remember, but then the next day it's like, oh, actually, I can't really capture it in the same way. So it's important to kind of like journal it right away, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I feel, and I tell my students that all the time. You've got to journal right away because all you're gonna remember is that got these points or got these achievements. You're gonna remember kind of the things that the game marks you to remember, right? I picked up these items and I picked up this loot, right? Because I have it. I remember it because I have it. But do I remember what it felt like? Do I remember, all the things I was thinking about as I was trying to get it, as I was negotiating with this person, or as I was like, figuring out this strategy, or as I was, creeping down this hallway? What was that like? What was I thinking about and feeling when I was making all those plans and having those experiences? And yeah, they fade away. It is a lot like a dream. It fades away.
Yeah, and that's one thing James Paul G said, is that the sort of act of making memories is attached to emotion. And that seems true for me when I think back on the things that I remember the most. Like, I remember reaching the end of Portal 2 at a time that was in great emotion in my life. And I guess the emotion doesn't even have to come from the game. Like, it's all tied up in this mess,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it is true that it doesn't have to be emotion from the game. It can be something happening in your life that's triggering that, emotion and that emotional response. But that again happens with all media, right? How many times have we read a book, at a particular moment in our lives that, just because it was that moment, we'll always remember it. I think Jim was talking about learning, and he was saying that you have to create this great emotion for learning to stick, right? And a lot of learning that we do in schools is done in this kind of very um, banal environment where there's no emotion. In fact, we're taught to sit still, sit quietly, not be having emotions. They don't want you to. They want you to be behaving, right?
Yeah.
And so there's no emotion linked to the exercises that you're doing. And so in a lot of ways that learning can't stick. It can't there's nothing to hang on to in you, right? But in games, whether it's coming from a moment in your life or whether it's coming from a moment in a game where you're stretching yourself really far, you really feel yourself growing and learning, it can often stick. It can often be something that stays with you that you can call back on later on.
It feels like a full circle for me because I feel like, I don't know if you remember back in 2007, I think was the first time I interviewed you.
I
Um,
you was what
deep
did we talk
cuts,
about?
deep cuts. at E3, and I was with a show, an Australian television show called Good Game, and you were on the E3 floor, I think, in the indie section. One of the hot topics at the time was, can video games be art? And that was,
Right.
a lot of the industry sites were asking these questions, and you gave one of the most concise and articulate and thoughtful answers that I've ever heard on it, and I was very impressed. And we showed it in its entirety on the show, and I sort of, I guess from that moment, I kind of followed you from afar, and I got your book, The Game Design Workshop, and I read through it. More so, I mean, I wasn't making games at that point, but I was more so just a critic, and I wanted to, understand games better. And so over the years, I've followed your shenanigans, and you've probably just seen my name pop up as I like your baseball photos on Facebook. But it kind of feels like we've come full circle because now in the games industry, of course, it's widely accepted that games can be art, and this book is kind of like a stepping stone or like a tool towards that, right? It's like games can be art. Here's a handbook for how to experience games as art, but it takes a little bit of work from the player side as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a really, really good way of putting it, and, I love that because the truth is one of the impulses behind doing this book, and I wanna also shout out to my co-author, Matt Farber, as well. You know, we really came together on why this book needed to be written, and it's exactly what you're saying. So, yeah, games can be art, but here's the thing, art has to be appreciated. You don't just appreciate art natively. I mean, I think, one of the wonderful things about art is that it exists in sets of layered experiences as well. So when we're young, sure, the type of art we like might be very easy to absorb, right? But as we get older, we need to learn to appreciate deeper, more interesting qualities in art. And what that means is that we need to educate ourselves. And um, I don't mean that in sort of a pejorative way. I mean, we need to uh, look inside ourselves, but we also look outside of ourselves. We build ourselves as richer response units, if you will. So basically, like I am able to appreciate more more complex pieces of art because I've been out there looking at life, looking at other pieces at, different types of art, other pieces of work. I've been talking to people about that work. The more I do that, the more I can appreciate. And then so forth and so on. It's a layered process. It doesn't just like say, "Oh, we all just get art." Right? So what we're saying in this book is we need to take those first steps in appreciating games. And it's not just becoming better players, right? It's not just becoming more expert players. That's only one piece of it. It's also being able to investigate our responses to the play, right? And articulate why that play is meaningful, why some play is more meaningful than others. All of these experiences build on us and make us more well-read players, not just better players, right?
It's funny you mentioned the term better players because, at the time on that show, I had a co-host, and people would always ask me, like, who's the better player? Who's the better gamer? That's kind of, at the time, gamer was more of an identity. And the fact that a show like that existed was kind of unique. And I come from an esports background, and a lot of the people that I would talk to at LAN parties, for those who remember LAN parties,
Yeah.
would be like, "Oh, who's the better gamer?" And I would always be a bit reflective, I guess, because in terms of winning the game and the game's objectives, it was me. but if you were to watch him play, um, I mean, the objective of a game is to have fun, right? That's the real objective. And then, like, for a lot of people, winning is like a stepping stone to fun because they find winning fun. But if you were to watch him play, he was always laughing. He was always finding new ways within the game to, like, maybe the designer didn't intend to just have a laugh, and he was always bringing other people into the fun,
Mm,
and getting them to laugh. And I was like, in terms of the real objective, I think he's the better gamer. And then as I read your book, I feel like I'm exposed to another dimension of, like, here's how you can be a better gamer is
yeah.
uh, having a better reading of the text and a better reflection of, what do I take away from this?
I love that, and I love your friend who brings people into the games too, because I think that that's such a gift, you know? We don't talk about it enough that there are people who are just really good at inviting everyone to play. And in fact, we already talked about Bernie DeKoven and his effect on my work and thinking. And Bernie was a person who did that. He was like the ultimate Pied Piper. You know, when he said, "Let's play a game," you were like, "Yeah, okay, let's play a game." You know, it's like it's so much fun. It sounds like Bernie's games always had this kind of mischievousness to them. You know, and so he was really good at that. And I think it's a yeah, we say, "Oh, who's a better player? Who's better, you know, a at this game?" And that's just only one facet of it. There's so many facets of inviting people to play, hosting play, and, then, of course, being able to sort of unpack and interpret play, right? So when we sit back after the game, who's better at telling the story? Who's better at bring us all back to that moment and putting a lens on what we just did, right? And I guess that's for me, that's a really important part of the story that we don't tell, right, about games, is that it isn't just saying, "Oh, that game sucked," or "That game was awesome." It's much bigger than that. It's the storyteller gonna sit back and say, "Oh, well, let me tell you about the time we played this game and this happened." And everyone it's not like the boring dream that your friend tells you about. It's actually a great story,
Yeah.
right? About some huge betrayal or something that happened, that was unusual and meaningful, and people are wrapped by it, right?
It was today that I learned I was a bad gamer.
Only in one sense. Only in there's like I said, there there's many we need all of the people to play well
Yeah, that's
together.
right,
We
yeah.
need all of the types. It's none of this is exclusive, right?
Yeah, 100%. Well, I say that in jest, but, in all honesty, I had a little bit of a feeling of sadness as I read the book because I felt like, there was this whole aspect of games that I've been missing out on. As I said, like, I come from an esports background, which is just all about devoting mental energy to getting a competitive advantage and analyzing the dynamics. And I do feel like that's helped me in my criticism, but also just like I guess there's probably cultural reasons. Like I spent a lot of my early life in Texas, where this sort of talk is seen as a bit artsy fartsy, and probably just the natural makeup of my brain. Being in touch with my emotions is not my strong suit. Like sometimes in high emotion moments, I kind of have to go away for a while, and like I can't even name what I'm feeling. I just have to go think about it for a while and then come back. And so this, by the way, I'm giving you my own aesthetic reading of your book. I just realized
Well, you're doing
that.
it very well, actually, and for
Oh,
someone
good.
who's saying, that they're not, able to unpack these things, you seem like you've thought about them quite a bit.
Maybe I'm not such a bad gamer. Um, but it made me sad that I was kind of missing out on this side of, I guess, of criticism and experiencing games, because I've always like prided myself on a more objective route, which I guess very much does come from that esports space where it's like, you talk about objective criticism in the book, but you're more so talking about like, the frame rate was 50 frames per second. The polygons were, 300 per something, like that's that kind of objective stuff. Whereas like my sort of like, I was always priding myself on focusing more on like, um, objective statements like, the asymmetrical factions in this RTS are not balanced because that. And I felt like a lot of critics were avoiding that. Because it's hard, because you have to put a lot more work in to make a statement like that. But B, because you open yourself up to the comments. Like when you want to make objective statements about games, for better or worse, there's going to be people in the comments with opinions about it. Whereas if you make subjective statements about games, no one's going to jump in the comments and say, no, you didn't have that experience.
Oh, yes, they
So,
will. Oh,
oh, they
yes,
will?
they will.
Oh,
Oh my
okay.
goodness, yes, they will. You clearly haven't, been a woman online.
Oh,
Um,
there we go.
not to say that should have been, but I'm just saying, yeah, honestly, yes, gaslighting is a thing. You
Okay.
saying that you did not have that experience, or that's you didn't play it right, is 100% a thing. But here's the thing. I think, you made a comment about, uh, you know, the work you put in to make those objective statements. And I agree. I think that's right. I think there's a lot of work that you put in to analyze the systemic nature of a game. And I think that, by the way, that's beautiful and a wonderful way of looking at games. There is an and equally important amount of work that can be put into a subjective reading of a game. They do
100%.
not they do not, we can have both, and we
Yeah.
should have both. And that is the beauty of reading games, is that you can read them from with many lenses. You can read them from many points of view, right? Just because I want to read it from an aesthetic point of view doesn't mean that I don't also like to break down all the classes and, look at the tech tree and all that. I mean, I
Right.
also like to do that, right? What I'm trying to do is open up the dialogue around the things that we don't talk about, which are those emotions that are evoked, right? And as we try to increase the breadth of games, as we try to make games and try to see games through, I feel like, their natural conclusion as a deeply important art form, um, we have to talk about them in a variety of ways. I feel that we can't just talk about them in one way or the other. They are not just systems. They are also play. And so play is not something that, it's very messy and it's very interpretive, right? So uh, when we say there are systems of play, often we're sort of leaning on the system side, right? And I just want to get over to the play side and say, yes, as I play this game, I feel this way. I mean, how many of us can look back on our childhood and remember moments of play that were either the best moments ever or the worst moments? Like, do you, I remember not being picked, for the team, right? Who doesn't remember a moment like that? That's not the rules of the game. That's
Mhm.
the play, the meta experience, right, of being denied a position, on a team, right? Um, and who doesn't remember, you know, winning at a game that they were supposed to lose, right? So, winning a game of chess against my father and being so full of absolute cockiness and pride and
Yeah.
just like, you know, I was not supposed to win that game and I win it, right? that's not the rules of chess, but it's an important part of it, right? And it's we don't talk about it, and I think we should, right? And
Yeah,
I think that we should train ourselves to become better appreciators of not only the systemic aspects, but also the playful responses.
mm,
Why are these an important uh, form for us to be engaging with? I think it'll make us better people, really, honestly.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, better, and as Rosenblatt said, sort of better citizens in a
Yes.
democracy, more engaged
That's the
citizens.
ultimate goal, is that if we can engage in these competitive rule-based systems, which, oh, by the way, are the same kinds of systems we're engaging in our supposedly democratic systems, right? Maybe we become better players of the larger games in our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the realizations I came to when reading the book is that, like, I mean, I guess I was exposed to this whole way of experiencing games as a whole, but within the criticism space, I guess I had always felt like people were using the sort of subjective framing as a crutch, and some would use I language like I, me, as a way to avoid tough conversations. Um, and so I would avoid that I guess in a way to sort of force myself to do the work. But as I was reading this and being exposed to a new way of playing, I was like, well, this is not lazy. This is the opposite of lazy.
Yeah, it's a skill, and we have to build it and practice it, and I'm not sure that this is taught, this self-interrogation, right? It's taught in literature, right? It's definitely something that, as we point out in the book, it's a scaffolded learning process that is taught. The very format of, say, children's literature teaches us to go from very, very simple stories to more and more complex thinking about those stories, right? The language that they use, um, you know, the type of situations, that characters are in, and, the sort of structure of saying, "Okay, this is a story that's going to have a happy ending," versus, "This is a story that's gonna introduce complex ideas to you, and it's not gonna necessarily end in a happy way." Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but you will have to engage with questions that don't have easy answers, and, children's literature walks us through that, until we get to the point where we can engage with adult literature where it's even more complex, right? So it's scaffolded into the very nature of children's, young adult literature. Um, we don't really have that in games, quite frankly. Games themselves teach us how to play them, but not how to read them.
Similar to how within the children's book space, they sort of slowly introduce those new concepts. What sort of escalating trail of games would you recommend for those who want to start to take an aesthetic stance towards playing?
That's such a great idea. I mean, it's such a great question. One of the first is unpacking, which I think is it's the ultimate argument for aesthetic reading, to be honest with you, because the game it has nothing in it unless you are doing an aesthetic reading, and it basically proves the point that people are doing aesthetic reading, because all the game is you click on boxes and unpack things and put them on shelves. And you do it over and over and over and over again. And if you are not thinking and interpreting and wondering and asking questions and building a sort of lived experience out of that event, then the game means zero. And so we know for a fact that it does not mean zero, because so many people have unpacked hundreds of boxes in unpacking and, had a deep experience about it. Therefore, they are doing it. Therefore, this game proves that we have aesthetic experiences when we play games, right? So to me, I'm like, okay, yeah, I mean, there it is. There's a game that you cannot play without bringing yourself to it. If you do not bring yourself to it and interpret what you're doing, there is no story, there's nothing. It's just clicking on boxes. And
Yeah.
we know it's not. So it's actually a very deep and powerful experience, and what's so great about that little game is that, I mean, just is that it does so much with so little, right? But the one of the great things about it is it takes such a universally, known, such an archetypal experience, moving, right?
Mm.
Moving into a new space is wrought with tension. It's
And
wrought with,
emotion,
like,
right? Like,
an
when we talk about,
emotion.
like, memory and emotion, like, it's one of the highest stress times in life, right?
High stress and high anticipation. It's all the good and the bad wrapped up together in objects that we are putting and taking out of boxes and moving from one space to another and trying to create our identity around space and things, and it's just so everything is so encapsulated. So that to me is a really good one. The other one that we use in the book is Lost Words, which is a children's game, but one of the great things about it is that it takes the act of reading and it gamifies it in a way. I don't like gamify as a word, but I have to
Yeah.
use it here, because it makes the page, the written page with words on it, into a platforming game. And we play as a young girl who's she journals. Her grandmother gives her a journal, and she's learning to tell stories, and her stories fill the pages of her journal, along with all the things that are happening in her life. And there's this wonderful intermixing of the fantastical world of the game and the real world of her journal and her real life, which is going through some significant changes. Um, and that is, the message of reading a game, right? That we are mixing together our experiences in the games and our lived experiences, um, as people, right? And so I think that makes that game is a great scaffolding tool, and could be used to talk about how we might journal, just like the character in the game. We might journal about both our experiences in the game and how they relate to our experiences in the real world. And that's what ends up happening, is these things become deeply enmeshed, right? This was even though it's a children's game, honestly, it was so powerful because it is a game about loss, and I played it while I was still dealing with the loss of my father, and there were just moments where it just really hit me. There was a moment when I actually literally had to stop the game and cry. Not
Mm.
for what was happening in the game, even though it it was just for me. I was crying for me, right? And my own loss, right? But because the game brought me there, right?
Mm.
And I had literally just had to stop it for a moment because it brought me there so strongly, you know? And that, I think, it's important to know that games can do that for us, right? Not even just in their content, but just because sometimes the emotions of play can become so strong that they make us cry. I've seen, you know, people. We play big games, big physical games, with my students every year, and I've seen people just get so overwhelmed, that they kind of have to sit down for, and just the physical emotions of play can get to be so big, for them sometimes. And these are games where you're literally touching other people. It's very, some they go from being very wrestly and big to very intimate and small. And I think, again, all these things are very valid moments.
Not being in touch with emotions can cause them to build up for a time until there's, like, a catalyst, and then it all just comes out in an uncontrollable way. So these tools can, when you mention Lost Words bringing you to that point, I mean, it allows you to feel your feelings, and it's
Yes.
healthy to feel your feelings, right?
Yes. Yes, it's healthy. And, whatever media helps you to feel those, it's important to acknowledge them and let them, you know, if they need to overcome you, then let them overcome you, you know? If we don't let ourselves experience some of these more complex emotions, then we're not ever gonna get to the more positive ones, right? So when you block your emotions, you block all of them. So you're not experiencing the highs if you're not letting yourself experience the lows, you know? So, I think it's actually important to be, first of all, emotionally literate, to think about and be able to name and articulate the nuances of our emotions. I mean, that's work. It's a lot of internal, reflective work. Um,
Doing the work.
Doing the work, exactly, putting in the work. It's funny because games are great at, different kinds of difficult, complex emotions like rage and fear. Really great at aggressive, sort of, you know, more common negative emotions, right? But they're less they're less well known, I guess, and less well understood in the kinds of, more nuanced, difficult emotions like things like grief, and
Yeah.
loss. Although there have been many games about that recently, and I think it's really telling that so many young game designers want to tell stories about that.
And you're talking to all of these folks who've done their aesthetic, their readings of games, and then you've been talking to many people who've sort of communicating those readings with you. Um, are there games that tend to have a wide variety of readings and interpretations
Mm.
that are range from exactly what the author intended to, wow, I've never, are there certain games that just have that quality?
Yeah, I think, it's a great question, and we have a whole chapter on, you know, basically reading against the game, against the author's intention, and I would say that, one of the things that came up is things like open worlds, like the Rockstar games, I think, have a lot of, unintended possibilities in them, right? And, people live entirely different worlds. I mean, in different lives than the quests. Like they'll go in there and there's a great story we have in the book about this guy who's a ornithologist, right? And
Oh
he
yeah,
just is like taking pictures of all the different birds in the game, right? Which I love because I made a whole game about, looking at birds and nature, right? And I just think it's fantastic that he's doing it like Red Dead Redemption, right?
yeah, yeah.
And it's I think that's just wonderful. And I think so open world games have this fantastic quality where you just can ignore what you're supposed to do and just drive around. There's another great story, about, a woman, I think from Iran, who, was just driving around, and she's so happy to just be driving around Liberty City in Grand Theft Auto, because it's something that she was not allowed to do in her home, right? Because women are not allowed to drive. So she, was just like, "Okay, I can drive. Isn't this wonderful? Like, I can drive." I just think that's fantastic. For me, I also, loved, Red Dead, just for I would go out and ride in one of the first quests, they have you break a stallion, and I would ride my stallion through the night in the desert, and I just loved it. I would just love to ride through the night in the desert, and, I was one of my most tragic moments is when my stallion got attacked by coyotes and died, and I just it was heartbreaking to me, and 'cause that I had not protected him and he died, you know, but,
Mm.
um, I think, you know, open worlds have this wonderful quality about them. It's that they're sort of ripe for the readings, that are against all the intentions and yet totally valid readings and totally valid experiences that players love to have in them.
Yeah, it's the interesting aspect about open worlds because they seem to be ripe for that kind of reading because there's so many things that can happen, so many ways to interpret it. You can completely go off and do, what the designer didn't intend. But also there's this thing about open worlds. I mean, all games kind of have it, but I guess in my own headcanon, I've been calling it the uncanny valley of interactivity, where it's like you can only ever interact with so many things in the game. And I guess, like, whether it's, a door that you can't open
Yeah.
or, something else. And I guess the version of this in your story with the horse is when your horse died, you tried to bury it, but you
Yeah,
couldn't.
uh,
And eventually you went back to the town and your horse had just respawned.
and it was terrible. It was terrible. I rejected him. I rejected him. He was not my horse, you know? I could not accept him because, you know, the designers obviously thought they were doing something good in having my horse respawn, and I just could not accept this golem of my horse, you know?
Precious. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
We talked about the ellipses that some games have, such as unpacking, leaving out those
Mm,
bits of information deliberately, and it's something that literature can do as well as games. And I think when you arrive to something like unpacking or What Remains of Edith Finch or games like that, a lot of people might arrive kind of knowing what to expect, and they even if they don't have the vocabulary of aesthetic stance, they're kind of arriving with that or, semi that. Like, I guess there's already a lot of trust when you arrive to a game like that, that, there's going to be something there if you bring yourself to it. Whereas other games might need to build up a bit of that trust first. And I'm checking the time now. I've gone for almost an hour without talking about Dark Souls. So I'm patting myself on the back. But, Dark Souls, like, I think there are these bridge games, right? That, like, even if you're not expecting to have an aesthetic stance, um, or you play in an efferent way, I guess is in the book, you call it an efferent way, which is just playing, to complete the objectives.
yeah.
Players arrive expecting to play in an efferent way, but the game kind of like ninjas in this aesthetic thing. And like Dark Souls does that a little bit with its story because obviously, there's combat and it's very mechanical. But its story is not there unless you bring yourself to it in the same way that unpacking does. And, I'll also throw out like, the whole trilogy of Eco, Shadow of the Colossus, and Last Guardian as like very much bridge games that can like bridge the gap between the efferent and the aesthetic. Um, but I got to thinking about Dark Souls 2, where it's like, those ellipses were there in Dark Souls, but in Dark Souls 2, there were not as many connections. Like, there were some story connections. There was the opportunity for a player to question what happened. But because there weren't as many literal connections, I think a lot of people, for that reason, feel like Dark Souls 2 is the weakest in the series.
Hmm.
So it's almost like you needed to build up a trust with the player of like, there is something here, trust me. It's almost like, in a platforming game when you're jumping from platform to platform and like the screen suddenly stops. And it's like the game is asking you to jump off the platform into the unknown.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you don't have a trust with the designer, it's like, am I just going to die?
Right.
So, it's like, in a story sense, you need to give them something so that they have the trust before you launch into the true aesthetic.
I love that metaphor that the of platforming, and trust, because yeah, absolutely, listen, that you can have an aesthetic reading of a tree, right? You can have an aesthetic
Yeah.
like that, and who is the creator? I don't know, right? And what is the intention? I don't know, but I can have an aesthetic experience of a tree, right? Because I'm able to project myself and start thinking about that tree and bringing so many things to it, like, books I've read about trees and stories I know about trees you know, um, and that's wonderful, but it's because I want to, right? It's because I desire to have that kind of experience. And so it's not necessarily that the author, the designer needs to build the trust if they don't want to. It's that it's that the player needs to bring enough to the experience to build an interpretation. And interpretations can also can happen based on almost nothing, right? So I don't require that game designers change the way they design games. I don't require the designers of Dark Souls to put anything more in their game than they do. It would be awesome if they put more things for me to connect the dots and think about and interpret. That's wonderful, but I don't think, like, this isn't a call to action for designers to do anything different. What this is a call to action for players to be more reflective about their experiences. And if they find something in a game, that it's there. That's the bottom line. Who cares who put it there? If they find something in a game, it's there. So, I don't it's kind of like saying, "Oh, well, mystery writers should put deeper complex meanings in their genre fiction." Like, well, okay, maybe. But on the other hand, maybe I just love mystery writing so much and I am interpreting and having this really deep experience with it, right? And I don't need anything else. It's genre fiction. It is what it is. I don't need them to be different than they are. I do choose the games I play, the books I read, the music I listen to based on what I think I'm going to get out of it. And when I see a game that I think I'm gonna get something really interesting to kinda interpret, I'm gonna choose that. And
Mm.
and and what I'm saying is, this is a call to action to players to choose based on what you know, think you're gonna get out of something. The core idea here is that we as players demand more of our play, that we reflect more on it, that we value it more, and that, yeah, ultimately we seek out um, richer, more complex, more interesting experiences um, to play with.
That's so interesting. The idea of seeking out games not just for recreation value, but for what am I going to take away from this? How is it going to help me grow? Even in Dark Souls 2, which had those, I guess not as many connections in its lore to build the trust among players, I still came across one great, I guess we can call it a reading, on Reddit, of someone who was just, I mean, it was headcanon, right? It was, they weren't talking very much about what they felt, but they were bringing their own fiction to what was there. And
Mhm.
in a section, for anyone who's played Dark Souls 2, who remembers the lead up to when they find Vendrick, it's everyone just knows it as the Gauntlet, right? Like, it's one of the hardest parts of the game, where you face some of the toughest enemies. They have incredibly long range, and on top of that, you're waist high in water, so you're moving and you're rolling really slow while they're all just trying to, ping you with their spells. And everyone's like, "Oh man, that section, it was such a slug." But this one person on Reddit, who I'll always remember, had this reading of it, which was like, "This to me feels like a funeral procession, where there are these temples, the ruins of temples that were set up in this long path towards a tomb where there's a dead king who was revered. And, I can see how they might have, like, brought him along in a sort of ceremonial way, and the people casting spells outside are dressed like priests.
That's beautiful.
I was like, "This is now officially my headcanon. Thank you for doing the work."
That is beautiful. That is so that's an incredible reading. That's a fantastic and incredible reading, uh, and shared with you, and so brought into the discussion just like we, uh, ask for and anticipate, and fantastic. Love to hear people when they bring those kind of rich, imaginative interpretations.
I'll forever be grateful for that person posting it on Reddit. It is important, you say in the book, to create a space where we can talk about those things. Otherwise, we're not sort of being truly honest with ourselves, right? Like, I mean, if we want to have this truly honest inward reflection, we need to have a space where we can talk about some gnarly stuff, right? And Reddit is maybe not the place for that. Games discourse in general is maybe not the place for that. That's kind of it's a tough problem to solve in today's environment, isn't it?
Well, I don't know that, Reddit is a place for anyone to discuss, anything, personal or meaningful. I think that there's a problem in our culture right now where, we can't seem to have any kind of meaningful conversations, without pointing fingers at each other or accusing each other or somehow trying to destroy each other. So that's a problem beyond games. That's not something games can solve. But I do think that we shouldn't back down from trying. And if there's a way that we can use people's passions for games to teach them about having civil discourse around interesting, deep, and personal ideas, maybe we find a way to start scaffolding skills that we really need in our society. Talking about the things that happen to us, the meaningful things that happen to us, without destroying each other, if we disagree, I think is a skill we need. So it would be great if games were a place where we could talk about things like that.
Some of these things are not things that you would put out on the social media platforms. It's a little bit safer if you're talking about, like, a book club for games or something like that. But even then, it's like, if you want to confront some of these things, like, hidden homophobia, or like or hidden racism, or like, this game like revealed that in myself, and I confronted it, and I'm grateful to the game for doing that. And and that's where growth happens. But it's like, I would even feel afraid of having that conversation. You got to almost treat it like an AA meeting, right? It's like, we got to have rules around this. Like,
Right. It's gotta be a place where people can bring up those kinds of questions, like, how do we address this character and the fact that this character could be one with one gender identity or another changes the, say, narrative through line of the game, or my experience, at least, of the narrative through line of the game, because there are games where that is possible, and having a discussion around that could be a really meaningful thing, especially for, say, a young person who is navigating their own identity, right? So it has to be a safe place. I think that literature clubs and in schools, the way that they navigate this, where they have smaller groups and roles that people play to sort of self moderate around that. I think those are all models that could be used. They're already models for sharing, right? They already have a history of, like, this is when I come in to talk about a book, I'm going to be sharing my reading, right? So,
yeah,
changing it to be a game is I think a great model to just say, okay, we're having a book club, but it's going to talk about games.
yeah. I'm going to start the AA model of game club, where I stand up and say, "Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy, and I had a authentic experience in games that helped me grow."
I
Hi,
love it.
Jeremy.
I I love it. I love it. Well, also, one of it can be personal. It doesn't have to be. One of the things that we talk about in the book, which I think is a great way to do this, is co-playing with your friends,
Mm.
family, right? And so, you don't have to go out and talk to strangers, right? You can also just talk to the people who you're close to, and games can be a great way to open up conversations between you, right? Say, "Oh, I thought that they were doing this. Oh, no, I thought it was about this," right? "Did you notice this in that character's room or something?" Like open up conversations, and just because we're sitting here playing together, it makes it easy to have that conversation.
Yeah, and it's a crucial part of it, right? Like for the for anyone who hasn't read the book, like this is something that's emphasized in the well-read game, and it was like emphasized by Louise Rosenblatt, that this sharing of the experience is like a very important part of the process. This opening up to different readings and perspectives.
Yes, sharing and comparing, like, and sort of respecting the difference, right? Um, I think that's part of that's the best part is when you realize that your experience, maybe you had a great last night I was actually talking, on my own podcast, with, Celia Pierce, she was talking about Sleep No More,
Is that the
experience.
Shakespeare?
Yeah, it's based on,
Okay.
Macbeth, and, it's gone now, it's shut down, but, uh, the idea was it's in, like, 5 stories of this building in New York, and you come in, and it's, like, this hotel, sort of old, like, 1930s-ish, like, hotel, and you get this mask, and you wear this mask, and then you're set to wander around in this hotel following these characters as they essentially play out a version of Macbeth. Um but Celia was making a point that, by having these masks that you invite bad behavior, on the part
Mhm.
of the audience, that there were apparently some, like, bad touching, bad, like, experience of not goodness, and I was like, "Oh, that's so," because what happened for me was I experienced a kind of liberation, right? And so, yes, liberation can lead to bad behavior, but on my part, it made me feel like a fly on the wall, right? Like I could go and get right behind an actor and look over their shoulder at what they were doing, and, I had this sense of not being there because of the mask, and so she had a very negative experience about the masks, and I had sort of a very positive experience about the masks. So, neither one is correct. Just by they're all
Mm.
valid. They're both valid, and I'm sure there are many other nuanced, experiences that people had. Um, but what I'm saying is comparing those, you start to learn, "Oh, wait a minute. Everyone's experience is a little bit different, and that's okay. We can, talk about why and what caused that and what it means that we all had different experiences here. And I can
Mm.
apply that in my living of my life and transfer that knowledge, and by the way, it makes me more empathetic to others and their experiences." So, you know, that's why Rosenblatt believed that it was the core of a democratic society that we all, um, practice this art of, in her case, reader response and what we would call player response. That we practice this art of interrogating our own experiences, sharing our own experiences, and comparing and analyzing the differences, and understanding that we all have different experiences, and valuing all of those different experiences, even though they were different.
Yeah, and as you mentioned in the book, people who read regularly are more engaged citizens. They tend to donate their time more to
Mhm.
community services, tend to vote. In Australia, everyone votes. We have to. Uh, but
Good for you.
second of all, what's your podcast? I need to subscribe.
Oh, it's called Playthink, and,
Okay.
it's basically a live salon that we record at the Game Innovation Lab.
It's funny. I was thinking about doing something similar to that because a friend of mine was starting up. I don't know if you've seen the Game Club, which is like basically a book club for games. Guy Blomberg was setting it up. If all goes to plan, he will be the next guest on this podcast.
All right.
Of course, scheduling stuff, you never know what's going to happen, but, hopefully it's a big success and a lot of people join their local game club chapter. Obviously, as I'm reading this book, The Well-Read
Well,
Game,
obviously I will be listening to that podcast for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're 100% going to talk about The Well-Read Game because this seems like the book of the moment. It seems perfect for what they're trying to do. But just like with that in mind, and I guess for anyone who might try something similar, what sort of tidbits of advice would you give people who want to approach a game club but don't know what an aesthetic stance is?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, start with small games. I mean, one of the biggest issues with games is that they take so long to play. So, with a book club, you could finish a book in 3 or 4 sessions, right? Sometimes you just do it for 1 session, frankly, if they're short enough or if they're like genre fiction, right? Mostly games take us, many, many, many hours to play. And by the end of it, we've forgotten all of our experience. As we already discussed, we've forgotten all of the interesting, those moments have faded away like dreams, right? So the first thing I would say is start small. And then also I would say encourage people to bring in journals to talk about those moments, to actually journal their play, to have something to bring into the session, right? Don't just have them play the game, then come in and say, "Oh yeah, it was so cool when this happened. It was so cool with that," because that's not going to get you anywhere, right? It's not real. That's just going to be comparing the, you know, coolness factor,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
If you really want to have a focused discussion or focused readings, then have people journal and possibly even if they're willing to read from their journals.
Well, I'm super grateful. Thank you so much for making the time, and I
Oh,
really appreciate your design brain and all that you've done. Really, I'm grateful you exist. I'm grateful you're in the
oh,
world.
that's so kind of you, and I appreciate you bringing me on after all these years, I appreciate that it's a full circle moment for you. I think
Right?
that's really great. I love those when they happen. So,
Yeah.
let's bring games to their natural conclusion as the beautiful art form we all know that they are.